America watched him make millions laugh. His family watched him fall apart. Jerry Lewis spent 6 decades perfecting the art of making strangers feel joy. He was precise about it, almost surgical. He knew exactly which muscle in the human face responds to a certain kind of physical absurdity, and he had spent enough hours in front of mirrors, in rehearsal rooms, in the editing bay at 4 in the morning to have mastered it completely. The audiences never doubted it. The audiences always got what they came for. The problem was everyone else, the people who shared his address, the people who called him Dad. There is a home movie, shot sometime in the early 1960s, that Jerry Lewis kept for decades. In it, you can see his 5 sons at various ages running across a lawn in New Jersey. Jerry is behind the camera. He does not appear in the frame once. The film is maybe 3 minutes long. He filmed their childhood but was not in it. That detail is not metaphorical. It is just what happened. And it happened because Jerry Lewis had made a choice years earlier that comedy was not a job. It was the only version of himself that felt real. And everything else, the marriage, the children, the house on the lawn, was the performance. He was born Joseph Levitch on March 16, 1926, in Newark, New Jersey, to Danny Lewis and Rachel Brodsky, 2 vaudeville performers who were rarely home. His father worked the Borscht Belt Circuit, a string of Jewish resort hotels in the Catskill Mountains, where comedians, singers, and tumblers entertained crowds that had come up from the city to breathe summer air and forget, for a weekend, whatever they were trying to forget. His mother had a nervous breakdown when Jerry was a child and spent significant time in a psychiatric facility. He was largely raised by his grandmother. He was an only child. He grew up knowing that love was something adults left to go find somewhere else on a stage. By the time he was 5, he was already performing. His parents would pull him on stage at the end of their act, let the crowd see him, let the laughter wash over him. He remembered it later as the first time anything made sense. Not the applause itself, not the attention, but the specific sensation of performing a bit and having it land. The tightening of cause and effect into something you could control. The world outside the stage was unpredictable and absent. The stage was a room where outcomes were guaranteed, as long as you were good enough. He married Patty Palmer in 1944. She was a singer a year older than him, working the same circuit. They were both 20. They would stay married for 36 years and have 5 sons together, and the arc of that marriage would describe, more precisely than any biography, the human cost of being Jerry Lewis. He met Dean Martin in 1945 at the Glass Hat Club in New York. Martin was 27, working a lounge act, Italian dark, relaxed in the way that certain men are relaxed who have decided that charm is sufficient. Lewis was 19, scrawny, manic, still doing a record pantomime act where he lip-synced to popular recordings. The chemistry between them was not planned. It happened in the way that certain things happen in entertainment. Through accident, through proximity, through 2 very different energies colliding at exactly the right moment. Martin played the straight man who was actually funnier than the funny man. Lewis played the child who would never grow up. Together, they became, in a short period that almost no one would believe, if it weren't documented, the most popular entertainment act in the United States. Between 1946 and 1956, Martin and Lewis were everywhere. They headlined in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, filled theaters from coast to coast, appeared on the radio, on early television, eventually in 16 films. They were earning more money than virtually anyone in American show business. They were on the cover of every magazine that put people on covers. Dean Martin was what men wanted to be. Jerry Lewis was what men were afraid they actually were. The combination was irresistible. Jerry Lewis, during those years, was working at a pace that bordered on self-destruction. He was performing, writing material, studying film, analyzing his own footage, developing ideas about the nature of comedic performance that most people in the industry thought were absurdly intellectual for a man who made a living falling down. He was reading Chaplin, studying Keaton, corresponding with filmmakers in Europe who were beginning to treat comedy as a form worthy of serious analysis. He was a man with the metabolism of someone who cannot be still, because stillness lets the other thing in. And the other thing, for Jerry Lewis, was the question of who he was when he wasn't being funny. He was not a good father during those years. He was absent in the way that men of his generation were routinely absent and were not asked to explain. He was working. He was providing. He was famous and successful. And those things, in the logic of that era, were substitutes for presence. His sons grew up understanding that their father was a genius who belonged to the public, and that the portion of him remaining after the public took what it needed was small and inconsistent. His son, Gary Lewis, who would go on to front the band Gary Lewis and the Playboys, said decades later that he and his brothers would sometimes leave notes for their father in the kitchen, hoping he would find them before he left again, because asking him directly felt impossible. The partnership with Dean Martin ended in 1956. The reason, depending on who you asked, ranged from professional disagreement to personal estrangement to the simple wear of two people who had been too close for too long. The formal split happened on July 25, 1956, at the Copacabana in New York. They did not speak again for nearly 20 years. Jerry Lewis spent the period immediately following the split in what he later described as the worst psychological state of his adult life. He had oriented his professional identity around the dynamic with Martin, and without it, the question of who he was as a performer, as a person, became suddenly and uncomfortably open. He answered the question by doing more. He wrote, directed, and starred in a series of films throughout the late 1950s and 1960s that are, even now, objects of serious critical disagreement. In France, he was treated as an auteur, a complete filmmaker, on the level of the directors being discussed in the pages of Cahiers du Cinéma. In America, he was Jerry Lewis, the man who fell down. He directed The Bellboy in 1960, The Ladies' Man in 1961, The Errand Boy in 1961, The Nutty Professor in 1963. He was writing, directing, producing, editing, and starring simultaneously. And the films, whatever you think of them, bear the unmistakable mark of someone who cared with an intensity that most people in his position would not have bothered to sustain. The body was accumulating damage. Performing the kind of physical comedy Jerry Lewis performed for 20 years is hard on the joints, the spine, the soft tissue of the knees. In 1965, during a performance at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, he fell off the piano he was climbing, a bit he had done hundreds of times, and landed badly. The injury to his spine would require surgery and would introduce him to the medications that would become, for a decade and a half, another kind of performance, the performance of being functional. Percodan was the drug, an opioid painkiller widely prescribed in the 1960s and 1970s for chronic pain. Jerry Lewis would later say, in interviews that were remarkable for their candor, that he was taking 13 Percodan a day at the height of his dependency. 13. His body had adjusted to the drug so thoroughly that he required that quantity simply to feel normal. He was performing through it, making films through it, hosting the Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon through it. That annual Labor Day broadcast he had committed himself to in 1966 and would continue for 45 years. The telethon is its own chapter in the Jerry Lewis story, and it is a complicated one. Beginning in 1966 and running for decades, the MDA Labor Day Telethon was simultaneously a genuine charitable enterprise, a remarkable feat of sustained human endurance, and an increasingly criticized spectacle. In its peak years, Lewis raised hundreds of millions of dollars for neuromuscular disease research. But the format, which often positioned disabled children as objects of pity rather than dignity, drew criticism from disability rights advocates who argued that the telethon's emotional architecture was built on a foundation of condescension. Lewis was not receptive to this criticism. He found it ungrateful and said so repeatedly, in terms that suggested he believed his intentions immunized him from critique of his methods. His son, Gary Lewis, gave an interview in the late 1990s in which he said carefully that growing up as Jerry Lewis's son was a specific kind of experience that most people would not recognize from the outside. He said his father loved him. He said that. Then, he said that his father's love was something you had to fit into the available spaces, the gaps between everything else that claimed him, and that as a child, you learned to accept the shape of the love you got rather than the shape you needed. Jerry's marriage to Patty Palmer ended in 1980 after 36 years. The divorce was painful, in the way divorces are painful when they happen after decades, when they involve children now grown, when they require two people to look at an entire life and decide what parts of it still stand. Patty, in later years, gave few interviews. She did not make the dissolution of her marriage into a public document. She had been present for all of it and chose to keep that privately. Less than 2 years after the divorce, Jerry Lewis married Sandy Pitnick, a dancer he had met while performing in Las Vegas. She was 27. He was 56. They would have a daughter together, Danielle Sarah Lewis, adopted in 1992, and the marriage would last until his death. People who knew Lewis in his later years sometimes said that the marriage to Sandy represented, in some essential way, a second attempt at being a person he had not managed to be the first time. Whether that is generous or accurate is probably a matter of perspective. There was another son, a son named Joseph, born in 1964, the product of an affair Jerry Lewis had with a woman who was not Patty. Joseph did not know who his biological father was until he was an adult. He found out the way people sometimes find out things like this in the era before DNA tests made everything unavoidable, through a combination of documents, inference, and eventually a conversation that could no longer be postponed. Jerry Lewis acknowledged Joseph as his son. The acknowledgement did not, by any account, translate into a relationship of substance. Joseph Lewis died in 2009. He was 44. Jerry Lewis did not speak publicly about his death. The drug dependency that had been building since the mid-1960s came into full public view in the 1970s and early 1980s. Lewis checked himself into a treatment facility in 1978. He was open about this, or at least he became open about it later, in the way that certain public figures find it easier to discuss past crises than present ones. The withdrawal from Percodan after years of heavy use was, by his own description, extraordinarily difficult. He spoke about it in interviews with a directness that was not typical of public figures discussing addiction in that era, when addiction was still routinely understood as a character failure rather than a medical condition. He also developed a prostate condition that, untreated or poorly treated over time, contributed to a period in the late 1970s and early 1980s when his physical condition and his emotional state were both in serious decline. He gained weight. His performances became erratic. Some of the films he made during this period were received poorly enough to damage, for a time, the critical rehabilitation that European film scholars had been attempting to engineer on his behalf. He was simultaneously being hailed in Paris as a misunderstood genius and struggling, in practical terms, to maintain the career he actually had. He came back. This is a thing about Jerry Lewis that his critics tended to underweight. He had a remarkable capacity for return. In 1982, he appeared in Martin Scorsese's film The King of Comedy, opposite Robert De Niro, playing Jerry Langford, a late-night television host being stalked by a delusional fan. The role was not a stretch in any simple sense. Lewis was playing a version of celebrity exhaustion that he understood from the inside. But The performance was controlled and precise, and without the mugging that had made some of his earlier film work difficult for certain audiences. Critics who had dismissed him found themselves reconsidering. The film is now considered one of Scorsese's finest works, and Lewis's contribution to it is central. He and Dean Martin spoke again in 1976, backstage at a Frank Sinatra event. The reunion was brief and conducted in a charged atmosphere. Two men who had been closer than brothers deciding what to do with each other after 20 years of silence. They hugged. They did not reunite professionally until 1987, when Sinatra arranged for Martin to make a surprise appearance at a telethon. And Lewis, genuinely not expecting it, was visibly shaken. The footage from that moment circulates online and people watch it, still, because it contains something real. Two old men who had spent most of their adult lives not talking, suddenly in the same room, and neither of them entirely certain what to do with that. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995. Jerry Lewis was devastated. He said so. He said it in the unguarded terms of a man who had lost something he could not categorize. Not a friend exactly, not a colleague exactly, but a person whose existence had defined his own during the period of his life when definitions were being made. He said that there were things he had never told Martin and now could not, and that this was a specific kind of grief he had not been prepared for. His own health was declining through the 1990s and into the 2000s. He had pulmonary fibrosis, a progressive lung condition that required him to use supplemental oxygen. He had the ongoing effects of the spinal injuries. He had the residual complications of decades of heavy medication use. He continued to perform when he could. He continued to accept honors from institutions that were now treating him as a national treasure. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave him the Jean Hirschholt Humanitarian Award in 2009. He received honorary Palme d'Or at Cannes. He was decorated by the French government with the Légion d'honneur. The accumulation of honors late in life has a way of producing a kind of official version of a person, a version that smooths out the difficult parts, and Jerry Lewis, for a time, seemed willing to let that version stand. He wasn't always. There were interviews in his final decade in which Lewis said things that were surprising for their honesty and difficult to square with the monument that institutional recognition had tried to build. He talked about the sons he had not been present for. He talked about the marriage that had run out before the love did, or maybe the other way around. He talked about the years of medication in terms that were specific and unsparing. The quantities, the effects, the way the drug had done what it was supposed to do and also done things it was not supposed to do, and how he had let it because stopping meant the pain would come back and also the quiet would come back, and the quiet was harder than the pain. He completed one final film, The Trust, and made a handful of other appearances in his last years. He was in a wheelchair by the end. He was on oxygen. He was 90 years old. Jerry Lewis died on August 20th, 2017, in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was 91. Sandy was with him. His daughter, Danielle, was with him. The announcement from his family was brief, dignified, and said nothing about the complicated particular person the announcement was describing. His 5 sons from his marriage to Patty Palmer: Gary, Ronald, Scott, Christopher, and Anthony. Of these, Scott Lewis struggled for decades with drug addiction of his own, a fact that Jerry Lewis addressed in occasional interviews with a kind of helpless guilt that suggested he understood the inheritance without entirely knowing what to do about it. Anthony Lewis died in 2009 of an accidental drug overdose. He was 45. The father outlived 2 sons and did not speak publicly about either death in terms that lasted on the record. The French still regard him differently than Americans do. There is a version of Jerry Lewis that exists in the cultural memory of France as a philosopher of the body, a surrealist in a tuxedo, A man who understood something about human vulnerability that most of his contemporaries were too composed to acknowledge. That version is not false. It is just incomplete, the way official versions tend to be. The version that his family knew was something else. Not a villain, not a monster. A man who had learned, very young, that the self capable of receiving love was the self on the stage, and who had organized 60 years of living around that single early lesson. The people who needed more than that lesson provided for were the ones who lived inside the same house. They adjusted. They wrote notes and left them in the kitchen. They learned the shape of the love that was available. Some of them found their way through it, and some of them did not. In the home movie from the early 1960s, his 5 sons run across the lawn in New Jersey. Jerry Lewis is behind the camera. You cannot see his face, but you can tell from the way he holds the shot, from the care with which he follows each child across the frame, that he was paying attention. He was watching them. He was recording them. He was there that day, with a camera between himself and the moment, capturing it rather than entering it, sending it forward into a future where someone, maybe himself, would watch it back and feel something he had not known how to feel in the original. That is a particular kind of absence. It has a particular kind of love inside it. Both things are true, and neither one cancels the other out.